Welcome back to Open BXRx. COVID-19 has affected underserved communities in various socio-economical ways. Students and parents, for instance, have been feeling the educational impact. How has COVID-19 heightened the lack of equity in education? Joining us now to discuss is Francisco Araiza of Education Trust and Why. Thank you for joining us, Francisco.
Thank you for having me.
One of the first things I want to start with is, of course, learning about the Education Trust and Why and what the organization does.
Sure thing. So again, my name is Francisco Araiza, and I am the Associate Director of Policy and Research at the Education Trust. We are a data-driven advocacy and research organization focused on educational equity for all students, particularly students who are low income and students of color. So we focus on closing the gaps in equity, achievement, and opportunity from early childhood through college completion.
Can we talk about the lack of education justice prior to this pandemic, prior to COVID-19, before we discuss what's going on right now?
Of course. So I think it's important to just keep in mind the critical role schools play in the lives of all children and young adults. So they are a source of structure and stability, a place of learning and social emotional development, where meaningful relationships are built and nurtured. But we also know that students who are low income, students of color, English learners, and students with disabilities have less access to the high quality educational experiences that should be the norm for all students. So what we mean by that is that New York's most vulnerable students often lack access to strong, well-prepared and supported educators, gatekeeper courses that will prepare them for college careers and active civic life, and the type of funding that allows schools to invest in adequate supports and wraparound services.
And now, how has COVID-19 heightened these injustices and impacted underserved students?
Yeah, first, I think it's important to acknowledge that state and district leaders, teachers, and all school staff are really trying to work tirelessly to make the needs of students in a very unpredictable and fluid situation. But I think you're right that we must highlight how the crisis will impact the most vulnerable students and their families, since they will be impacted the hardest. The students who were underserved by our education system during normal times are also the most likely to be underserved by our educational system during this crisis. Again, schools play a critical role in most students' lives. For our most vulnerable students, that starts with something as fundamental as providing daily meals, which school closures have disrupted. But we also need to think about the way instruction will continue throughout the period of school closures. For example, do students have access to learning materials and technology and the resources that are needed for meaningful remote learning experiences?
And now, Education Trust and Why has conducted these recent polls regarding access to tech for remote learning. Can we learn about some of those findings?
So sure. Before we talk about the resources and barriers around technology, I think some of the other interesting things that we found in the poll are that nearly 90% of New York State's public school parents indicated that they're concerned that their child will fall behind academically as a result of school closures. So this is ranking higher than a lot of other or any other financial or social emotional concern for parents right now. Parents also said that regular access to their child's teacher would be the most helpful, even ahead of technology resources. So 95% of parents reported that it would be helpful to have access to their child's teacher, but only half of parents say their schools have made that available. So we definitely think there's an opportunity there for more concerted efforts to make direct contact with students and their families. As far as the technology issues are concerned, there's really three main things. First, there are not enough devices in the home. So approximately 64% of parents statewide say that schools lending mobile technology devices would be helpful. When you take a closer look at parents that have an income of less than $50,000 a year, that percentage increases to 72%. And there's also a lack of reliable high-speed internet for many families. So this is an issue we saw for a majority of New York City residents that feel less than confident that they will be able to participate in distance learning. And finally, there's nearly 1/3 of parents in New York City that report not knowing how to use the remote learning software and that has been provided. So there's definitely a digital literacy, yeah, that's happening there.
Right. And I've also heard about, students and parents who live in shelters who don't have access to this internet as well, or are, they're the last ones to receive these devices.
Yeah, so I think there's added issues for students in temporary housing when they're in shelters. A lot of the shelters have rules in place that don't allow them to take the devices into that space. And then, in addition to that, the high-speed internet can be a huge issue.
Right. Among these findings, Francisco, what are low-income parents' biggest concerns when it comes to their child not being in school during this time?
Yeah, so I think all parents right now are under a tremendous amount of stress. So approximately 80% of the parents that we spoke to are reporting higher levels of stress than usual. For a majority of families in New York City, they're reporting that they're concerned around their child feeling safe and emotionally at ease. So those are really big concerns. For low-income parents in particular, though, their biggest concerns are around having their child fall behind academically, which we've already talked about a little bit, but also lacking opportunities to socialize and to sort of be around their friends and teachers, and whether or not they can provide a safe home environment for their child.
Right. Now that we've discussed all of these issues and how the education system and parents and students have been impacted by COVID, can you tell us about the Education Trust's 6 steps that schools can take to address educational equity right now?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So we've really urged school districts to take the 6 steps to address educational equity. The first step is ensuring equitable access to learning materials. This would include the issues we've already addressed around technology, such as access to devices, high-speed internet, and support in navigating learning software. But really, it extends beyond that. It also means access to paper packets of materials and grade appropriate text to keep students engaged in learning. Secondly, we think that schools need to work closely with teachers and counselors to provide an appropriate amount of support. So schools should engage with teachers in preparing instructional materials to continue students' learning. We know that students right now are in a very unfamiliar territory, but that applies to teachers as well. And so we believe that there needs to be an added support to make sure teachers are delivering the best learning experience for students remotely. In addition to that, schools should also work with school counselors to meet the needs of students who rely on school counselors and psychologists for social emotional support, post-secondary planning, and just to deal with the added stress of the pandemic. And third of all, we think that the schools should really be addressing the specific learning needs of students with disabilities, English language learners, and students in temporary housing. So we've already covered some of those, but really, broadly speaking, school districts should ensure that the learning materials are made available to meet the specific needs of these learners, and that outreach is conducted to these particular students and families about the resources that are available. There's also a need to make sure that all information and documents are available in families' home languages so that they're reaching English language learners. Next, we think that there needs to be a focus on providing breakfast and lunch to students who rely on school meals. Now, we know the city's already doing that, but when we think about our poll, we found that nearly a third of parents either do not have access to free meals or don't even know that the resource exists. So we definitely feel like there's some room for improvement there. Many schools are already offering grab-and-go meals at school sites, but where possible, there should be access to these in the different levels in the community, whether that be food banks or other food pantries in other areas. We believe schools should be coordinating with trusted community partners. So schools should work with community-based organizations, faith communities, after-school partners, and other trusted partners to ensure clear and consistent communication for students and families around coronavirus and also school closures. We believe that schools should also connect with local organizations that maybe offer programming for other services for students when schools are closed. And this should all be consistent with the guidance that we're getting from health officials and other state officials. And finally, we think that it's really important for schools to be actively working on connecting families to other services they may need. Now, while schools cannot be expected to do everything, we know that they are a vital and trusted hub for students and their families in a time of uncertainty. Schools should work with their local governments so that they are able to point families to health, housing, legal, and other resources, recognizing that this is a period of economic hardship for a lot of families.
These all sound like pertinent solutions that will absolutely help a lot of parents and students that are uncertain during this time. Thank you for sharing, Francisco.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Mhm. Thank you for joining us today on behalf of the Education Trust NY. Folks, to see studies on education justice and find more information, you can visit newyork.edtrust.org. Open BXRx. We'll be right back.